Scotland, Stunning, Strange, and Secret. A Guide to Hidden Scotland. The Hidden Gems series by Christy Nicholas. Green Dragon Publishing. 4th edition, 2024. Copyright 2013 Christy Nicholas. Cover art copyright 2022 by Get Covers. Narration generated through AI. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, except in the case of brief quotations embodied in critical articles or reviews, without permission in writing from its publisher, Green Dragon Publishing. Beacon Falls, Connecticut. www.greendragonartist.com. Introduction. Scotland, the name conjures visions of tartan covering every surface, hairy Highland cows, the deep glowing gold of a dram of whisky, perhaps even Mel Gibson in blue war paint and a kilt. But beyond the tourist tat and the tacky gift shops, what is the real Scotland? What is the soul of the country, the hidden spirit that draws people back? One's memories are unique, so each person is going to have a different image of Scotland in their minds. It may be the food, the people, the landscape, the drink, the history, the music, or a combination of all of these that sings to a person's soul. There is a wealth of fascinating things to do, stunning places to see, and friendly people to meet in the mystical Highlands. Like the colors of thread woven in a tartan, the aspects change with your perspective and with time to reveal previously hidden depths. I have always had a special fondness for Scotland and Scottish customs. My great-grandmother was a Mackenzie, so I knew I had a blood connection. I first visited in 2000 for a Mackenzie clan gathering, a trip much too short. We've returned and spent time in the Highlands and the Islands, Edinburgh and Inverness, the coast and the mountains. It is a place to be at home in front of the peat fire, eating your porridge and drinking your dram. In this book, I will explore many aspects of Scotland. I will delve into the history and myths that shaped the culture, as well as the superstitions and beliefs that still hold sway today. Parts of that are, of course, the ecclesiastic traditions, the Highland culture, and the various invasions from Ireland, Scandinavia, and England. I shall talk about the food, the music, the people, and, of course, the drinks. Some practical aspects to planning your trip and your photography are next, as well as some discounts and tricks to save some money. And, of course, a nice big section on hidden gems, places off the beaten track, to get away from the busloads of tourists and find your own special places. Please, enjoy your journey through my book. And, if I have convinced you to travel to this incredible place, please let me know. I think everyone should visit Scotland and be enriched by this incredibly stunning, strange, and secretive land. History and myth. What we know and what we believe. Prehistoric. Crossing into the land that is now Scotland, through the primordial mists of history, the first settlers on the land came when the last glaciers were retreating, about 10,000 years ago. At this time, it is believed that the land was still connected to continental Europe via a land bridge that has since been flooded with the melting of the glaciers. Little is known about these Mesolithic people, but some have left their mark on the modern landscape. There is a small encampment found near Biggar, dated to around 8,500 BCE, and the remains of a wooden house near Queensferry from around 8,240 BCE. These help paint the picture of a population who moved around in boats from place to place, using stone and antler for tools. The Mesolithic period, however, made way for the Neolithic period, as people settled down into permanent villages and began farming the land. The stone house in the Orkney Islands called the Knap of Howard is dated from around 3,500 BCE. One of the more spectacular remnants of the Neolithic people is a previously buried underground village in the Orkney Islands called Skara. Dated to around 3000 BCE, this is one of the few non-ceremonial ruins from that time, showing a domestic life not all that different from ours. Imagine living in these structures. The Orkney Islands are very remote, yes, and also very windy and cold. We visited in June, and some days it did not get higher than 50 degrees Fahrenheit. There must have been a very short growing season, if they cultivated much at all. Most of their food would have come from the sea, and perhaps some land animals and foraging. The houses at Skara Brae were built underground, out of the raging winds and cold. They made bedsteads and shelving from long, thin stone planks, a central hearth fire, and tunnels to travel from home to home, to avoid the harsh winter weather outside. This is also the time when stone circles and chambered cairns dominated the land, such as the Ring of Brodger, the Stennis stones, and Callanise stone circle on the Isle of Lewis. There are hundreds of these monuments around the country, some no more than ankle-high remnants of once proud and tall stones. As the Bronze Age arrived around 2000 BCE, the natives started building hill forts, most likely for defense and domination. Alden Hill near Melrose is one such example, and probably held several hundred houses. Smaller round houses of stone, such as Jarlshof and Sumburg on Shetland, and crannies built on artificial islands, were common. Around 700 BCE, technology advanced and the Iron Age arrived. Simple roundhouses began to replace the earlier structures. These were circular, built without mortar, and increased in complexity as time went on. They had a large, central pillar, sometimes elaborately carved into designs made to look like a tree. These evolved into the great circular stone brocks, such as those found in Caithness and the Isle of Lewis. Brocks are drystone hollow-walled tower structure of a type found only in Scotland. Picts and the Roman Empire. Little is known of the people who occupied the houses and forts on Orkney, but the evidence we do have suggests they were fierce fighters, dedicated to their gods, and highly independent. Later accounts by the Romans, of course, painted them as cruel barbarians, and called them the Pictii, or the Painted Ones, due to their tradition of using war paint. This was not an unusual tactic for Roman propaganda. They often built up the image of their foes to make good press at home. The Picts were an agrarian society, living in small communities, with cattle and horses being signs of wealth and prestige. Carvings show eagles, boars, wolves, hunting with dogs and falcons, and even women hunting on horseback. Their normal crops included wheat, barley, oats, and rye, as well as cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and carrots. Garlic, nettles, and watercress flavored their dishes. Wool and flax were common clothing materials. Fish, seals, and whales were hunted for food. They were known among themselves as the Catavilanii, the people of the cat, the Damnonii, the Epidii, the people of the horse, the Veniconia, the Novanti, the Carinii, the sheep folk, the Smyrti, the smeared people, and many other names which have disappeared in the mists of time. They were a unique society, a prehistoric people who survived into current times through myth, legend, and artifacts left behind. The Romans attempted to conquer 18 different tribes they had listed in Scotland. Circa 71 CE, the Roman governor, Quintus Petilius Cerealis, had launched an invasion into the territory, and General Agricola is said to have pushed his troops to the River Tay. When the positions won became untenable, the Romans pulled back to what is now known as Hadrian's Wall. While few Roman citizens lived beyond this line in the sand, they lived in constant danger of the Pictii. The wall was the first time the Roman Empire had declared an end, even temporarily, to their outward expansion, and may have been the first signal of its eventual contraction. The Romans tried once more to conquer the lands, making it as far as the Firth of Clyde, where they built the Antonine Wall. However, it was overrun and soon abandoned in 160 CE. After Roman withdrawal, 4 tribes gained dominance in Scotland. In the east, the Picts held sway over the land from the River Forth and Shetland. They were known as the Kingdom of Fortriu, and likely had their seat at Menteith or Strathen. In the west, the Gaelic tribe of the Dalriada, having come over from Ireland, had their fortress at Dunad in Argyll. The southern kingdom of Strathclyde was of Brythonic ancestry, also known as Alt Clut, and held their seat at Dumbarton Rock. In the southeast was the kingdom of Bernish-Nisha, descendants of the Germanic Anglo invaders. From this latter kingdom came the Anglo-Saxon kings of Northumbria. There are some interesting historical fiction/fantasy books written about the Pictish king Brede by Juliet Marelier, and well worth the read if you are interested in this mysterious race. While we do not have much direct evidence of their lifestyle, the novels show a people with a great respect for the gods, for hospitality, for the wisdom of the elderly, and the creations of their skilled artisans. They held wells and rivers sacred, and carved stones with curvilinear designs, which if you've ever tried to work with stone, you will know is not easy. Some aspects of the religion, in Marelier's books, at least, are very dark to our modern-day sensibilities. I believe them likely in the Bronze and Iron Age beliefs, as there are dark aspects of the world that could not otherwise be explained. While they were likely closely related, the Picts and the Gaels were separate groups. The Gaelic kingdom of Dalriada was founded in the 6th century in the west of Scotland. It was close to this kingdom that the Irish priest and missionary Columba came, having been exiled from his native land by his brother, the king. He founded the first Scottish Christian community at Iona, and it still stands today as a spiritual retreat. Legends relate that settlers from Greek Asia Minor sailed the seas and arrived in Ireland at Cruachan Felly, the mountain of Ireland. After some time, the tribe of the Scotii crossed the Irish Sea to invade Caledonia, north of Roman Britain, and settled in Iona. Supposedly, the tribe had been named after Scota, the Egyptian wife of a Spartan commander Nell. This is just one of several legends behind the Gaelic invasion of the land of the Picts. Sometimes Scota is described as being the sister of the Egyptian pharaoh, Tutankhamun. While the Picts did try rejecting Gaelic and Christian influence, it eventually took over, and the Picts intermarried with the Gaels to become the Scots. The Scotii were one of the Irish tribes that came over during that time, and they gave their name to the land. Their union was a result, ultimately, to the incursions of the Vikings from all sides and the Saxons that came up from the south. They combined to fight, forming the Kingdom of Scotland. There is a fascinating book by Brian Sykes, called Saxons, Vikings, and Celts, The Genetic Roots of Britain and Ireland. The book explores the DNA evidence of settlement and invasion by the various groups into Scotland, Ireland, England, and Wales, and comes to some fascinating conclusions about these invasions. The Kingdom of Scotland. The first king was Cenad mac Ailpin, Kenneth MacAlpin, as a result of a merger between the Gaelic and Pictish lines around 840 CE, though his line was disputed throughout many successions. After Kenneth passed on, his successors, Mael Colum I, Malcolm I, and Mael Colum mac Ceneda, Malcolm II, helped solidify this kingdom. The arrival of Constantine II, who retired as a monk in St. Andrews, may have helped Christianize the kingdom and kept the Celtic Christianity in line with Roman beliefs. The last of his line was Malcolm II, who died in the early 11th century, passing the kingship on to his daughter's son, Duncan I, of Macbeth fame, known as the head of the House of Dunkeld. According to Shakespeare, Duncan was killed by Macbeth, who was then overthrown by Mael Coluim III, Duncan's son. Mael Colum III, also known as Sean Moore, Great Chief, was the man who brought stability and power to the House of Dunkeld. He had many descendants, and, despite the frightening tendency for them to kill each other, established a dynasty that lasted 200 years. However, his second marriage, to the Anglo-Hungarian Princess Margaret, prompted William the Conqueror to invade. Mael Colum submitted, which opened later claims over Scotland by the English crown. One of his successors, David I, started what was called the Davidian Revolution. This was due to his upbringing as an English baron and his love of English and French ways of life. The Scottish traditions and institutions were slowly replaced, and members of the Anglo-Norman nobility took places in the Scottish aristocracy. He introduced feudal land tenure and knight service, as well as a tradition of castles and cavalry. He created royal burghs, facilitated economic development throughout the country, and helped bring Scotland's structure in line with other nearby countries. These reforms were continued by his heirs until Alexander III in 1286. When he died, the only heir of the line who remained was his infant daughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. There is the tragic story about Margaret, this young heiress to a disputed throne. She was the one person who would save them all from civil war and unrest. While sailing to Scotland to be installed in her kingdom, her ship was tossed by storms and driven off course. Shortly after it landed in St. Margaret's Hope in South Ronaldsay, Margaret died. It is thought she died from the effects of seasickness, aged 8. When Margaret died, the nobles of the land asked Edward I for his advice on which of the 14 rivals should rule. After choosing John Balliol as the successor, Edward I then claimed Scotland was now a feudal dependency of England. Edward I used this as a wedge into which he tried sending troops to conquer Scotland. After John Balliol set up an alliance with France, known as the Auld Alliance, Edward invaded Scotland and deposed King John. The movie, Braveheart, focuses on this time in history. While the movie is not very historically accurate, the fact is that Edward I, known as the Hammer of the Scots, did not succeed in his quest to conquer Scotland, due in a great part to the work and patriotism of William Wallace, and Edward wasted considerable time and power in the attempt. After the time of William Wallace and Edward I, the rule of Scotland went to Bruce I, aka Robert the Bruce. While he was crowned in 1306, he didn't have clear rule until a decisive win against Edward II in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was written by the victors and sent to Pope John XXII, a stirring and ringing statement that claimed, "For, as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself." This document still rings true and proud among many of the Scottish people today, much as the Declaration of Independence does with Americans. Indeed, many think that the American document was fashioned, in part, after the Scottish Declaration. Subsequent attempts of Edward III to subjugate Scotland failed, and he lost interest when the 100 Years' War with France started. The House of Stuart. After David II, the last of the Bruce line, passed in 1371, the first of the Stuart kings, Robert II, came to the throne. Due to infighting and mysterious deaths, his son, Robert III, sent his son, James I, to France for safety. He was captured by the English, though, and held for 18 years. In the meantime, James' father died, leaving regents to rule Scotland in James' absence. When he finally returned, he asserted his authority, executed several people who opposed him, and succeeded in centralizing crown control. However, this draconian behavior, while good for the realm, was bad for his popularity, and he was assassinated. A couple generations later, James III married Margaret of Denmark, acquiring the Orkney and Shetland Islands as a dowry. This marked the passing of the islands from Norse rule into Scottish rule. While the islands are Scottish, they retain much of their Nordic feel, and many of the place names still retain their Norse spelling. Even the English spoken there has a musical Nordic lilt. James' son, James IV, then married Margaret Tudor, laying the groundwork for James VI to inherit the English crown in the 17th century. During James IV's reign, there was much educational reform and creation of institutional infrastructure. It created a cultural renaissance which is still felt to this day. In support of the Auld Alliance, when France was attacked by Henry VIII, James IV invaded England. He was killed in the Battle of Flodden Field, along with many of his nobles. This battle was commemorated with the traditional and very poignant song, Flowers of the Forest. The heir, James V, was an infant, and in control of the regents. James V wasn't an incredibly effective monarch, and he made 2 marriages to French noblewomen, Madeleine of Valois and Marie of Guise. He died after another disastrous campaign into England, but not before he was brought news of an heir. This daughter would become the infamous Mary, Queen of Scots. Much has been written of this ill-fated queen, and I shall only touch the highlights here. There is an excellent historical fiction novel written by Philippa Gregory on her life, her loves, her many poor decisions, and eventually her tragic death. She was raised mostly in France, betrothed to the Dauphin, heir, of that country. Her mother, Marie of Guise, acted as regent in Scotland, though in an unofficial manner. She did rally the Scottish and French troops against the English occupation and managed to eject them from the country. While there was trouble brewing between the Protestant and Catholic factors in the country, Marie of Guise did promote French culture and manners in the Scottish court. Again, this had repercussions for many years, both for good and for ill. When Marie died in 1560, the Auld Alliance fell apart and the Scottish Reformation abolished Catholicism in Scotland. Of course, the young heiress, Mary, was raised as a Catholic in France and had married her intended. Unfortunately, she was widowed at 19 and came to Scotland to take up her crown. She was circumspect in her religion and did not force her beliefs on her now Protestant nation. However, this not only angered the Catholic nobles, but it was not accepted by the Protestant subjects either. Her short reign of 6 years was a series of crises, intrigue, poor decisions, and betrayal. She was tricked into marrying a useless courtier, Lord Darnley. He angered the court with his extravagances and lack of propriety. Her Italian Catholic secretary, Riccio, was murdered. Shortly thereafter, her second husband, the ineffectual Lord Darnley, was also murdered. She was then kidnapped by, and then either eloped or was forced into marriage to, the Earl of Bothwell. This led to her imprisonment, abdication, and long exile at the hands of Elizabeth I, her cousin. In the end, after many lonely years of imprisonment, she was executed as a Catholic martyr. The aforementioned Protestant Revolution was a particularly strict movement under the teachings of both Martin Luther and John Calvin. The survivor of a pogrom in France, John Knox, emerged as a leader of the movement and managed to convert most of the lowlands. The Highlands and Islands mostly remained Catholic, except for those isles known as the Wee Free Islands. When the Protestant James VI succeeded the deposed Queen Mary, and later became the heir of Elizabeth I of England, he united the two kingdoms in 1603. It was after this time that the Scots settlement of the Ulster province in Northern Ireland began, starting a long war between the Protestant Anglo-Scots and the Catholic Irish they supplanted. This dynasty was interrupted due to Charles Stuart, Charles I, and his mismanagement of the crown and the dichotomy of his mixed religion countries. The people of England rebelled and started the English Civil War. This resulted in beheading the king and placing a republic in his stead. This period is known as the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, as there were also revolts in Ireland and Scotland at this time. In Scotland, the Covenanters, the strict Protestants, were left governing and offered assistance to those opposing the king in England. They were opposed by an army of Highlanders and Islanders, led by Alistair MacDonald, and this started the Scottish Civil War in 1644. Inexplicably, he abandoned his successes against the Covenanters, and they had the victory. After Oliver Cromwell ruled this commonwealth, he invaded both Scotland and Ireland to cement his subjugation over these lands. He gained a reputation for ruthlessness in Ireland but died without a strong leader in England to take his place. At that point, Charles I's son, Charles II, was asked to come back to the crown. The Stuart line was once again in charge of both Scotland and England. It was not to last, however. Charles II's son, James VII and II, was Catholic, and this just made matters more heated and contentious between the Catholics and Protestants of all nations under his rule. He made it worse by placing Catholics in key positions and alienating his Protestant subjects with unpopular laws against their worship practices. His daughter, Mary, was a Protestant and the wife of William of Orange of the Netherlands, and this seemed the best solution to the Protestants. The Revolution of 1688, aka the Glorious Revolution, forced James to flee, and William and Mary were invited to rule the Union. This restored Presbyterianism and abolished the bishops, though William tended to be more tolerant than many of his predecessors. Despite this solution, there were still many supporters of the Stuart line, and for several generations, the Jacobite, from Jacobus, the Latin name for James, revolutions of the next century flared up. The first one was led by John Graham and a group of Highlanders at the Battle of Killiecrankie in 1689 but was defeated. In the aftermath of this resounding defeat, a tragic misunderstanding and heavy-handed retribution resulted in the massacre of Glencoe, between the MacDonalds and the Campbells. In 1707, the Act of Union brought England and Scotland together as one economic and political unit, allowing greater trade, and replacing Scottish systems of currency, taxation, and laws. The Jacobites. This move was unpopular in Scotland, of course, and the Jacobites rose again, under James VII's son, James Francis Edward Stuart, aka the Old Pretender. He had lived in exile most of his life, and attempted several failed invasions, most notably in 1715. It was ruined by a failure of coordinated risings in Wales and Devon, lack of leadership, bad timing, and bad luck. By the time James finally landed in Scotland, he was told it was hopeless, and so he fled back to the relative safety of France. If you would like a glimpse into what life may have been like, watch the movie Rob Roy, starring Liam Neeson. Rob Roy was an historical character, though the stories of him are mixed. Some show him as a cattle-thieving rogue, others as a national hero, standing up to the oppressive evil English landlord. I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle. The real Rob Roy lived near Balquhidder, and there is a small cemetery there, where his grave is situated. In 1745, his son, Charles Edward Stuart, tried again to reclaim the Scottish crown. He was the Young Pretender, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. The nickname Charlie most likely came not from a diminutive of the name Charles, but from the Gaelic for Charles, Chirlac. This rising was more successful, and he won some important battles, such as Prestonpans. Several clans joined the movement, albeit some very reluctantly. While he was successful at first, and managed to secure a good chunk of Scotland, he became greedy, and tried moving south into England. This overextended his resources, and many of his allies changed their minds. The rising ended with a horrible defeat by the Duke of Cumberland at Culloden. Charles fled to exile again, never to return. If you ever visit Culloden Field, please take the time to explore the visitor center. It has very poignant presentations on this time, this battle, and the events leading up to it. It is very moving, even if you have not a drop of Scottish blood. The loss at Culloden broke the Highlanders and the Jacobites. What followed was a horrible part of British history, the Highland clearances. In order to remove the teeth of the Scottish clans, the English outlawed Highland dress, custom, language, and capriciously stole from, killed, arrested, and transported thousands of Highlanders. These transportes ended up in Canada and America, often as indentured servants. Crofts were burned, cattle were slaughtered, valuables were stolen, and women were raped. Much of the land that was cleared of troublesome Highlanders was used for sheep, to support the budding wool trade in England. Imagine living on a small farm. Life is hard, but peaceful. You tend your crops, your cattle or flock, and have enough to support your small family. There are, perhaps, for families within 10 miles, also crofters. Your husband has gone off to a neighboring farm to help them with a building. Then the soldiers come, they slaughter the cows you rely on for your milk, run your sheep off, trample your crops, perhaps even salting the ground. They tear the door off its hinges, and violate you and your daughters. They leave, taking anything they think might be valuable, and you have no one you can complain to, for they are the Crown's troops. You must either find a way to survive, leave, or perish. It was a very dark time, though many have managed to remain to this day. There is a series of historical fiction called Outlander, by Diana Gabaldon. While it is fiction, it gives an excellent account of this time in the first 2 books of the series. You get to meet Charles as a historical character, as well as many of the Highlander clan chiefs of the day. You read about the conditions of the army, including a detailed description of the Battle of Culloden itself, and much of the aftermath. For more movie and literary places in Scotland, please see that section in Cayley's and Flings. Many of the Highlanders were arrested after Culloden and ended up either dying in prison or being transported. Others ended up in America, Canada, and Australia, where they did their best to begin their lives again. Many of them were crofters. Others were fishermen and did well in coastal regions. Some ended up fighting in the American Revolution, 30 years later, some on the American side, some on the British side. Lowlanders had it easier, partly due to religion and partly due to politics. Most of the Lowlanders were Protestants and supported the King of England, so took up positions of power in politics and business, as well as in the military and colonial enterprises. This helped bring Scotland into the realm of a world trading power. The Scots developed a reputation of being fierce soldiers in the British Army, not only in World War I and World War II, but other wars, such as the Crimean, Napoleonic, Indian, and Boer Wars. The Enlightenment. In the 18th century, a transformation occurred, taking Scotland from a poor, rural, agricultural society to a leader in modern industry. Glasgow and Edinburgh were the chief leaders of this transformation, using the tobacco, textile, and sugar trades, as well as the Enlightenment to increase the culture and wealth of the nation. The previously created education system developed into an excellent university system and helped foster what was known as the Enlightenment in France. Philosophers such as Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, and economist Adam Smith became leading speakers and authors of the day. Smith's book The Wealth of Nations is still being used today in economics classes. I know, I had to read it. A good banking system was set up in Scotland to deal with the burgeoning trade, especially in linen, and this structure stood them in good stead throughout the American Revolution and the shift in industrial needs. The beliefs of the Scots continued to fragment into the Protestant Church of Scotland in the Lowlands and the rather pagan-tinged Catholicism of the Highlands and the Islands, mostly the Gaelic-speaking areas. Later, the Free Church of Scotland formed, closer to the strict beliefs of the Covenanters of an earlier era, and very accepting of Gaelic language and culture. This has grown much in the Highlands and Islands. On some of the islands, known as Free Islands, businesses are closed down on Sundays to this day. No pubs, no grocery stores, no shops, nothing is open on this day of rest. The greats of Scottish literature appeared at this time, such as Robert Burns, best known for Auld Lang Syne, Sir Walter Scott of Ivanhoe fame, and Robert Louis Stevenson, with Kidnapped. Burns is widely regarded as Scotland's national poet and typically wrote in Scots dialect, which is a mixture of the older Anglo-Saxon Germanic language and Scots Gaelic, sort of a first cousin to modern English. In other areas, the arts started playing a more important role in Scottish society. The Celtic Revival and Art Nouveau helped this, and architects such as Charles Rennie Mackintosh and his painter wife, Margaret MacDonald, reinvented the style of the age. Industrialization. Growing from the primacy of the linen trade in the 18th century, Scotland became a world centre for engineering, shipbuilding, and locomotive production in the 19th century, first with iron and then onto steel. Even today, the rail system in Great Britain is useful and well maintained. This transportation system allowed Scottish products to easily make it to London markets, where Aberdeen Angus beef gained a world-class reputation. Coal mining was huge and helped fuel the British Empire. By 1914, there were 1 million coal miners in Scotland, giving a stereotype of rough, British, isolated serfs. Industrialization took over from the southwest to the northeast, and Glasgow became known as the second city of the empire, after London. Housing in the city became paramount, and overcrowding became endemic. This overcrowding also led to the formation of the first Municipal Fire Brigade in Edinburgh. This period also saw a resurgence of love for the Highland culture, assisted by Queen Victoria's love of the Highlands. Her purchase of a wee house at Balmoral, adoption of the tartan in the Highland regiments, and the resurgence of Celtic ideals in literature and art helped all this along. Kilts were, all of a sudden, fashionable again after King George IV wore one on his visit to Scotland in 1822. This was the beginning of clans being identified by certain patterns of tartan, despite claims of an earlier correlation. What few people know is that the Highlands also had a potato famine in 1846, as Ireland did. The difference is in the response of England to the crisis. In Ireland, the English landlords continued to ship out all the foodstuffs, leaving the Irish to starve or emigrate. In Scotland, the farmers were actually given emergency relief measures to keep the people from starvation. What was life like for a 19th-century Scottish crofter? His diet would typically be of potatoes, herring, oatmeal, and buttermilk and milk straight from the heifer. He would work the land for his landlord and usually be able to grow enough for his rent, with a bit left over to feed his small family. He was likely still Catholic, but had a strong belief in the other world, the world of the fairies. He would likely be illiterate and perhaps only speak Gaelic. He would live in what was called a black house, a crofter's hut made of stone with a thatched roof and was shared between the family and the few animals they kept. The hut could be very smoky with the peat fire inside, and smell, but one benefit of having animals indoors was in keeping the room warmer, especially in colder seasons. And a poor crop would likely result in eviction if the tenant couldn't pay their rent. While the population grew with the industrialization in the 19th century, it contracted again in the turn of the 20th, with about 2 million people migrating to North America and Australia, about 30% Scotland's total population. These migrations ended only with the Great Depression, as no jobs were available abroad, and the vestigial wartime industry in Scotland offered some hope of employment. The 20th century. The advent of both world wars showed that Scottish soldiers were still forces to be reckoned with. They continually showed their merit, with a reputation for fierce recklessness and lack of fear in battle. They wore their kilts and played their bagpipes proudly. And it may just be that, perhaps, their love of whisky, shared with their fellow troops, was behind the resulting growth in that industry after the war. In World Wars I and II, Orkney played a major part, being an important Royal Naval base, with shipyards and heavy engineering works in place. It was attacked several times by bombers, and, fearing submarine attacks, Winston Churchill deliberately sunk several ships in the water surrounding the entrance to the harbor, to limit access. These are called the Churchill Barriers, and can be seen to this day, resting away between islands in the archipelago. If you would like to visit them, you can see them along the line of islands that lead up to the Scapa Flow. During World War II, a group of Italian POWs were held in Orkney. Hoping for a place to worship, they used a Quonset hut and built a lovely little Italianate chapel, using paint to imitate tilework and iron scrap for the wrought iron works. It stands there today on Lambholm Island, a wonderful little jewel. After wartime, Scotland began declining economically and only recovered in the 1970s due to oil in the North Sea. Today, that oil is a big part of the Scottish economy, offering jobs and export income for the nation. Tourism and a growing awareness of their rich agriculture have helped tremendously. In 1999, a Scottish Parliament was formed with devolved powers from the UK Parliament. Independence, however, remains a hot issue in politics today, and came for another vote in 2014. It was declined by a narrow margin but will likely come up again in a few years. Summary. Scotland certainly has a rich and varied history, full of drama, battle, mystery, and bravery. Perhaps they are more contentious than other populations, perhaps they just have a more recent war tradition than other cultures. The land itself plays a big part in the history of these people, offering barriers to invasion, growth, and prosperity. But still, it is a history well worth learning, to understand the background these people have, the proud traditions, the fierce, fighting spirit, the incredibly strong work ethic, and the strong ideas that help lead the world today. What does this mean to the traveling tourist? It means that almost every square foot of this country, every rocky mountain, every mist-covered glen, every deep, dark loch, has a story. You could plan your visit by theme, visiting the Castle Trail, or the Whisky Trail, or the Pictish Stone Trail. You could tour the Highlands and the Islands. You could travel around the coast by boat and hop from place to place. You could even rent a black house on the Isle of Lewis and live as those at the turn of the century, with no electric or plumbing. Do you find peace watching the sunset over the islands? Or stepping into a structure that's over 5,000 years old? Would you be thrilled with seeing the soaring architecture of Edinburgh? Or the glistening granite in Aberdeen? Perhaps you prefer bird watching in the uninhabited natural islands of the Outer Hebrides. There is no end to the creative ways you can tour this wonderfully diverse country. Superstitions and beliefs. The world of myth is filled with fairies, creatures of mystery, curses, blessings, hidden treasure, and dark souls in the night. Every realm of creativity touches on these subjects: literature, film, music, art, dance. They all delight the mind and the imagination with sprites, goblins, and dark banshees. Scotland's traditions are certainly no exception. Some of the tales and beliefs in the Scottish Highlands and Islands are shared by other groups of Celts, such as the fairies. Others are unique to the Scottish pantheon of beliefs. While Ireland has a more cohesive set of these fairy tales, there are several that were transported to Scotland's hills and glens with the Irish migration, and many that could be leftovers from the Pictish times. I find Scottish myths have a darker theme than most of the Irish myths do. Perhaps this is because the country itself is a bit rougher in geography, less gentle in its mountains and coastlines. It could be because it has longer nights in the winter, being farther north. Longer nights meant more time inside, sitting around the hearth, so more time to tell stories. You wouldn't be idle while the stories were told. You could be spinning, or mending a harness, or whittling buttons, but you listened as the stories were told. No matter the reason, there are very few stories that are sweetness and light. Begone the sugarplum fairies of Victorian lore. Here are the Scottish tales. Do keep in mind that the Scottish fairy beliefs, as well as modern pagan beliefs, are a living tradition. Please treat them with respect. And Farliam Moore, the big grey man of Ben Macdui. Also known, a bit more easily said, as the Grey Man, this monster, or possibly a spirit, haunts the mountaintop and passes of Ben Macdui, the highest peak in the Cairngorm Mountains of Scotland. He is said to be a very tall figure covered with short, grey hair, and causes hikers to be very uneasy even when not seen. There is some evidence of photographs of footprints and reports of sightings, but nothing concrete or provable. While he is thought to be a supernatural being, he is also compared to Yeti and Bigfoot. In mainland Europe, creatures called Woodhuas, woodmen, have been reported back to the 13th century and are thought to be descendants of their Cro-Magnon ancestors. Hikers in the area frequently report they feel and hear someone following them, but the mists obscure any figure. One such report was by climber John Norman Colley in 1925, where he described hearing the crunching footsteps behind him in the mist, but with strides several times longer than his own. Aes She, fairies. These were the original pre-Christian divinities of Gaelic Scotland. The takeover of Christianity reduced these beings to hold only diminutive powers, also known as the Tuatha De Danann in Irish folklore. There are several different sorts of fairies in Scottish legend. Many people believe that some are angels that were leaving heaven, so when God saw the Exodus and closed the gates, he trapped many of them on earth. Other sorts are believed to be the spirits of dead ancestors. Aes She are often bribed or mollified with offerings of food or drink, and care is taken not to insult or offend them. Many of their names were euphemisms to avoid angering them, such as the good folk, the fair folk, the good neighbors, or Daoinshi, people of peace. The Aes She often guard particular places, such as a hill, a hawthorn tree, a loch or wood. Dusk and dawn are particularly dangerous to encounter them, as are the feasts of Samhain, Beltane, and Midsummer, summer solstice. There are many types of fairy creatures, such as the Sluagh She, the fairy host, the Cat She, fairy cat, the Siouxsie, fairy dog, and the Leonanshi, fairy lover. Arthurian legends. While most of the tales of King Arthur took place in England and/or Wales, one of his traditional rivals, King Lot, was king over Orkney. Arthur's son, Mordred, was raised in his household. While there is little that we know for certain about these tales, there is no end of the variations to them, and many of them touch Scotland. Bonnie. A washerwoman in Scottish Gaelic, she is seen as an omen of death. She can be seen near streams and pools, washing the clothes of those who are doomed to death, turning the river red with the blood. Banshee. Related to the Banshee of Irish legend, this spirit attaches itself to a family or clan and keens with the morning of an upcoming death. The Blue Men of Minch, also known as storm kelpies. These odd creatures occupy the water between the Isle of Lewis and Scotland. They look for sailors to drown and stricken boats to sink. Bonnie Prince Charlie and Flora MacDonald. When Bonnie Prince Charlie came to Scotland to reclaim his father's crown from William of Orange, he succeeded for a while, but was soundly defeated at Culloden in 1746. He was then forced into hiding and ended up on the Isle of Skye. He had relied on a faithful supporter, Flora MacDonald, to disguise him as a woman and smuggle him there, from where he could take a ship to France. The event inspired a song, still sung today, called the Skye Boat Song. Speed Bonnie boat like a bird on the wing. Onwards the sailors cry. Carry the lad who is born to be king. Over the sea to Skye. Boo-bree. A mythical water bird of the Scottish Highlands, thought to be similar to the great northern diver, but with the ability to roar. Brian Seer. He was a prophet, or seer, known to have the second sight. His true name was Coinich Odhar, and some of his visions are thought to have come true. He foretold the Battle of Culloden, the doom of the Seaforth Mackenzies, and the building of the Caledonian Canal. Perhaps his foretelling of black rain on Aberdeen was a vision of the oil industry off the coast of that shire. Brownie. A good-natured, invisible brown elf or household goblin. They will only work in night, in exchange for a small gift or food, especially honey or porridge. If they are misused, they disappear. A small stool was often left near the fire for him. Some households had a brownie stain, or a small stone with a hole into it, where they would pour a bit of the brewed beer for him. I find many similarities between this legend and the house elves of Harry Potter fame. Keshk. A mermaid, half-woman, half-fish creatures. They are also known as Maideen Vara, Maid of the Sea, and have the power to grant 3 wishes to anyone who catches one. While there are some tales of sailors being lured to their death by these maidens, they seem to have a more beneficent demeanor than other cultures' tales. Changelings. Sickly offspring of fairies who are secretly switched in place of a human child. If you can see them with true sight, they appear as little old men or women. The human child usually dies shortly afterwards. Clootie. A Scottish name for a rag. The word clute, perhaps referring to cloven-hoofed animals or the devil, though traditionally, a clute is a strip of cloth or rag used to make clootie rugs and to patch worn clothing. These strips of cloth were also used to make clootie pudding, a steamed bread, the dough being wrapped in the cloth then hung over simmering water to cook. This is likely where the term clootie tree comes from, a tree upon which people tie strips of cloth or rags that represent wishes or blessings, to be sent out as the fabric deteriorates. There are many clootie trees around the British Isles, usually around holy wells. See the Hidden Gems section for more information. Fakan. Also known as Peg-Leg Jack, he is a creature with only half a body. He has a mane of black feathers, and a very wide mouth. Supposedly, he is so frightening he can induce heart attacks. Fairy Flag of Dunvegan. According to legend, a chieftain of the MacLeods married a fairy woman, but could only keep her in a mortal life for 20 years. When she left, he chased her, hoping to keep her with him. All he caught, however, was her shawl. The shawl could be used by the MacLeods in battle to summon a fairy host 3 times. It has been used twice and remains on display in Dunvegan Castle today. I've seen it, in its glass case. Gilly Dhu. A solitary Scottish elf, guardian spirit to the trees. He is dark, clothed in moss and leaves, and is kind to children, but shy around adults. It's possible this is a remnant of the memory of Druids, the priestly class of the old Celtic religion. They were said to live in the trees, or at least worship in groves of oak trees. Hauntings. Many of the ruined castles of Scotland boast a ghost or two. Some of the more well-known castles, with their hauntings, are Bothwick Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots. Braemar Castle, a young, blonde girl. Castle Fraser, a young woman murdered in the 19th century. Cotter Castle, a lady in a blue velvet dress. Corgarth Castle, screams but no apparitions. Craigievar Castle, one of the Gordon family. Culzean Castle, a ghostly piper, and a woman in a ball gown. Edinburgh Castle, many, including a headless drummer and a ghostly piper. Eilean Donan Castle, a Spanish soldier, and Lady Mary. Glamis Castle, Earl Bairdie, who plays cards, the Grey Lady, a tongueless woman, and many others. Hermitage Castle, My Lady Greensleeves. Kelly Castle, and Erskine. Needpath Castle, a girl who died of a broken heart. Skibo Castle, a young girl. Stirling Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, as well as a green lady. Tantallon Castle, a woman who looks down from a barred window. Kelpies. Kelpies are usually freshwater creatures that occupy lochs and lonely rivers. They are also known as Eek Wist, or water horse, and are sometimes associated with the Loch Ness Monster. This creature appears to his victims as a lost dark gray or white pony, but with a mane dripping with water, perhaps with some seaweed woven in. If a person were foolish enough to ride on its back near the water horse would take them down into the water to drown. Apparently, the rider is safe if there is no water nearby. Once the rider is drowned, the water horse will eat him, except for the liver, which is allowed to float to the surface. They have also been known to turn into handsome men to lure women to their death. The legend of Robert the Bruce and the Spider. In 1306, Robert the Bruce became King of Scotland, but was immediately attacked by Edward I of England, forcing him into hiding. He hid in a cave on Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland, and there, watched a spider spinning a web. He watched the spider try again and again before finally succeeding. This supposedly inspired Bruce to carry on fighting the English. He defeated Edward's armies in 1314 at Bannockburn. The legend of Sawney Bean. Scotland has many tales of creatures, monsters, gods and goddesses, however, some may have been human monsters. This particular gruesome legend would make a great horror movie. A couple of books and horror films have certainly drawn on the legend. Alexander Sawney Bean may have just been a creation in folklore, but the story has survived since the 15th century. Sawney Bean was the head of a criminal, cannibalistic family. Legend says he and his wife, along with their 46 children and grandchildren, killed and fed on over 1,000 people before they were captured and executed. The family lived in a cave near Benane Head, between Girvan and Ballantrae, for over 25 years. They had 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandsons, and 14 granddaughters. The grandchildren were, supposedly, the result of incest. Not caring for honest labor, the family ambushed, robbed and murdered travelers, the bodies brought back to the cave, and eaten. The discarded bits washed up on nearby beaches and were noted by the nearby villagers. When searching for the family, several innocent people were lynched, some were local innkeepers, being the last to see many of the victims. One night, they ambushed the wrong man, as he was skilled in combat, and fought the family off long enough for a group of fairgoers to come by and see them. Now that the culprits were known, a manhunt was organized with 400 men and bloodhounds. They found the cave, and the family was captured alive. They were taken to Tolbooth Jail in Edinburgh and executed without trial. Much of this information comes from local broadsheets and diaries of the time, which are suspect, but kernels of truth may be the sources of the legends. The Linton worm. This dates back to at least the 12th century. A great serpent that lived in a hollow on the northeast side of Linton Hill. A local laird heard of this worm and its destruction of the nearby villages, and he tricked the worm by jousting it with a flaming lance. The death throes of the worm supposedly created the odd topography of the region, now known as Wormington. Loch Ness Monster. The Loch Ness Monster, or Nessie, is probably the most famous of the beliefs of Scotland. She was first cited by Saint Columba in the 6th century, when the saint made the sign of the cross to keep the creature from killing him. The monster lay dormant for centuries, emerged again in the 1930s, and has been a tourist magnet for Loch Ness ever since. Speculation on what this creature really is has run the course from a surviving dinosaur to a hidden time vortex below the lake. Many photographs, often proved to be fakes, have shown this creature, with a long, slender neck and humps showing above the surface of the loch. Loch Ness is very long and narrow and surrounded by mountains. It is also very deep with black water, making visibility poor in the best of times. Although many expeditions have been launched to prove her existence, to date, none have succeeded. Morag of Loch Morar. Similar to the Loch Ness Monster, this creature lives in Loch Morar, another long, very deep mountain lake, with only a short distance to the sea. Sightings started in the late 1800s and through the 1960s, many of them involving multiple witnesses. Red Cap. Also known as the Powrie, or Dunter, this malevolent dwarf or goblin lives on the Scottish border in the ruins of ancient castles. They murder travelers who stray into their homes, and dye their caps with the victim's blood, hence the name. They must kill regularly, for if their caps dry out, they die. The only way to escape is to quote a passage from the Bible, which causes them to lose a tooth and leave. They are often said to appear as sturdy old men with red eyes and taloned hands. Sir Rory Moore's Horn. This is also in Dunvegan Castle. A new chief must drink a full measure of wine from this horn in one drink. The present chief evidently succeeded, in under 2 minutes. The Scottish Play. Most thespians refuse to say the name of the Shakespearean play, Macbeth, for fear of black tidings and ill luck. I'm not certain why, perhaps because everyone dies in the play? Perhaps because Shakespeare wove a real witch's curse into the story? Some say it began the night of the first time the play was performed, when an actor was killed with a real dagger which had been replaced for the stage prop. Selkies. These creatures were able to take both seal and human form. The word for seal in Scots was selch or selk. Usually female, a human man could keep a selkie as a wife if he found and hid her seal skin. She would be a good wife and mother, and guarantee a fisherman an excellent catch, but if she found her skin, she would return to the sea, often taking her children with her. There are several films, mostly Irish, featuring with selkies, such as The Secret of Roan Inish and The Seventh Stream. Shawnee. A water spirit who had to be offered ale to leave you alone. Perhaps they will sit and enjoy a pint with you after a long day of work. Shelly Coat. A Scottish bogeyman who haunts rivers and streams. He is covered with shells, which rattle as he moves. They are considered mostly harmless but may mislead travelers. They play practical jokes, like pretending to drown, and then laugh at the distracted would-be hero. Stone of Destiny. Also known as the Stone of Scone and the Coronation Stone, this was evidently used by the kings of Dalriada at their coronations which they brought with them from Ireland. Around 840 CE, it was taken to Scone, where it remained until Edward I removed it to London in 1296. It was placed under the throne at Westminster Abbey until 1996 when it was finally returned to Edinburgh Castle. There are legends that it was originally used by Jacob in Israel, who brought it to Ireland. Other legends say that the Lia Fáil, a stone on the Hill of Tara in Ireland, is part of the same larger stone that the Stone of Destiny was cut from. Thomas the Rhymer. Also known as Thomas of Eildon Hills, he lived on the Scottish borders around 1300 CE. He met the Fairy Queen and dwelt in fairyland for 3 years, some legends say 7 years, though it felt like 3 days to him. Upon his return, he had the gift of poetry and prophecy, making his fortunes in rhyme. He is believed to have predicted the union of the crowns in 1603. Other legends say he asked for a gift to show he had been in fairyland, and the queen gave him a tongue that could not lie, a distinct disadvantage for a diplomat or a courtier. Wolvers. Good-natured werewolves, with the body of a man and the head of a wolf, they left fish on the windowsills of poor families and were particular to the Shetland Islands. Most Scots figure, even if you don't believe in the fairy folk, you shouldn't do anything that may anger them, and you should always keep an open mind as far as the other world is concerned. Iron or a Bible verse seems to be a rather universal charm against mischief. If you feel the need to calm an angry spirit, offer them a bit of fruit or a lovely flower. If you have lost something, a bribe and a polite request for its return often does the trick. Come to think of it, being respectful works for all sorts of folk, fairy or otherwise, does it not? Gods and saints. People of any age hold many things sacred. Holy wells, stone circles, a mountain top, a ruined church, the remains of a good man, or a piece of paper. Today's holy things may be family, money, status. But in the past, in the lands of the Celts, it is sometimes difficult to determine what was held sacred, and why. This is because the Celts did not write things down very much. It wasn't forbidden, there are writings from Gaulish people that date to 600 BCE, but it certainly wasn't common, or if it was, such writings have not survived. A tradition of writing didn't arrive to most Celtic lands until the Romans arrived, and for some, such as Ireland or northern Scotland, not until the Christians came to convert the natives. Stories were handed down within the families, told from grandmother to grandchild. They were cherished as histories and lessons and were held in a sacred trust. Kings had bards and historians who kept this sacred task and who were able to call up a personal lineage or ancient tale from memory. Most of the tales, legends, beliefs, and histories we do have were actually transcribed by Christian priests, usually well after the fact, and invariably colored with a Christian view on it. As a result, we have had to guess, through inference, outside accounts, and what little has survived the centuries, what the Scots held sacred. Many were also collected and published by various more modern authors, such as Lady Gregory and Walter Yearning Evans-Wentz. The advent of Christianity brought the tradition of recording beliefs, so it is easier to find the saints among the gods. But even then, local legend, politics, and missing records make holes and gaps in the accounts. Regardless, Scots have traditionally held strongly, even fiercely, to their beliefs in the powers that be. Here are some of those powers explained or, at least, described. Gods and goddesses. Unlike Ireland, which is rich in the tradition of pre-Christian deities, Scotland has relatively few gods and goddesses to claim as its own. Many of the deities they do have are shared with other Celtic lands, such as Wales or Ireland. Often we just have names, but no legends, no attributes, no details to flesh out the ideals that name was attached to. While there were plenty of fairies and spirits, deities were rather thin on the rocky ground, so to speak. The Cailleach. The one goddess that does have some substantial lore about her in Scotland is the Cailleach, the hag goddess, a winter goddess. The surviving tales could very well be a mixing of several separate legends from antiquity, some forgotten local deities, but she is definitely deeply ingrained in the landscape of the land. Her name is found in many crags, valleys, and rocky places around both Scotland and Ireland. The Cailleach is said to be a giantess who carries stones in her apron, and as she drops them, forms the mountains in the land. She is also part of a legend that says, on February 1st, she goes out to collect firewood. If the weather is poor, she cannot go to collect any, so she stays inside. This indicates that winter will be over soon, as she doesn't need any more fires that year. If the weather is fair, though, she goes and gets more firewood, and therefore winter will last another 6 weeks. Does this sound familiar? It should. It sounds remarkably similar to the Groundhog Day tradition in America and may have been its progenitor. Glen Lyon has a small dry stone house or shrine called Tyna Kalish, thatched and kept in good order. There are 3 stones inside, the largest of which is called the Cailleach, the second is the Bodak, old man, and the third is the Nagian, daughter. The legend of this place says that a couple of unnaturally tall stature came here one stormy, snowy day. They asked, and received, shelter from the weather, and decided to stay. The people built them a small house, and they had a daughter. While they lived there, the crops and livestock of the valley flourished. When they decided to leave, they made a promise that, as long as they were remembered, the winters would be mild and the summers warm. The people of the glen still tend this shrine today. Other mentions of the Cailleach are in the island of Shuna, where there are rocks called Cailleach Bur's Staircase, and in Moray, where there is a small loch called Loch na Kalish. Loch Etive has some stones called Cailleach Bur's Clackerin, or stepping stones. In Corvreckan, there is a famous whirlpool in the straits between Scarba and Jura called the Cuara Bricane, Cauldron of Plaids, the tub in which the Cailleach washes her blankets. Finn Mac Cumhaill. There are several Irish legends involving Scotland, such as that of Finn Mac Cumhaill, a giant of a hero of Irish fame, who built the Giant's Causeway from Northern Ireland to the Isle of Staffin in Scotland. Both sides of this causeway have odd hexagonal basalt rock formations. The story goes that the giant had a lady love in Scotland and built this bridge to visit her. However, his girlfriend already had a suitor, Benandanur, and a big, ugly brute he was, too. So, fearing this rival, Finn ran back to Ireland, dressed himself as a baby, and curled up to feign sleep. When Benandanur came over to see who this other suitor was, he saw the giant baby. Thinking it was a child of Finn's, he imagined that Finn, as an adult, would be so much larger, and ran back to Scotland, destroying the causeway as he did, to prevent Finn from coming over in retribution. Scahawk. Another Irish legend on Scottish soil involves the Irish hero Cuchulainn. He was the warrior's warrior, unbeatable, incredible battle prowess, the strength of 10 men, all that sort of stuff. He got his combat training from Scahawk, a warrior goddess who lived on the Isle of Skye, and ran a school for warriors, both men and women. Cuchulainn had to pass several complex feats of physical and mental prowess before he was even accepted as Scahawk's student, but excelled at these tests, and proved his worth. While he was there, he met another student, a warrior woman. Then he fell in love and had a child with her. Ahin. Many place names could be derived from ancient deities, such as the River Avon in Banffshire, from the Gaelic Gaedlig Ahin, meaning the very bright one, supposedly referring to the wife of Finn Mac Cumhaill of Irish legend, who drowned in that river. Before her death, the river was called Ishke Bown, or Fair Water, a name not so dissimilar. Other gods. Many of the Irish gods and goddesses went to Scotland with the Gaelic invasion of the Dal Riata in the period of 200 to 500 CE, such as the Dagda, Macha, the Morgan, Luff, Baylor, and Nuada. I have visited a forest near Dundalk called the Hermitage, where there is an Ossian Hall. Oisin is the son of Finn Mac Cumhaill, facing a triple waterfall, 3 being a mystical number in many religions. Some other gods, such as Tyrannes the thunder god, were common to many Celtic groups. Shoni was prayed to for good fishing, and the Sluashi was the host of the unforgiven dead, riding the night skies. I've heard this legend in various forms, such as the Wild Hunt. Ireland and Scotland share many of their gods and legends, since the people in both moved back and forth during the centuries. Saints. Saint Andrew. It is widely thought that Saint Andrew was born in Galilee, and that he and his brother, Simon Peter, were disciples of Jesus Christ. This actually helped him become the patron saint of Scotland in 1320, as it was felt that he outranked St. Columba due to this relationship. He is also known as Protokletos in the Orthodox Greek tradition. Legend has it that several relics of Saint Andrew were brought to the modern town of St. Andrews by a Greek man named Regulus to the Pictish king Angus MacFergusa in the 8th century CE. Another legend has the same Pictish king, during a battle, saw a cloud shaped like the saltire, white cross, and declared they were being watched over by Saint Andrew. As a result, the saltire was adopted as a symbol and national emblem of the Scots. There are several relics associated with Saint Andrew, including his finger bones, a tooth and a kneecap. These relics meant that the Church of St. Andrews became a pilgrimage destination for medieval travelers, up until their destruction during the 16th century. Saint Andrew is the saint of many things and many places. The Greeks, Russians and Romanians hold him as patron. In addition, he is patron saint to women who wish to become pregnant, maidens, spinsters, and those with gout or sore throats. Saint Adomnan of Iona. Saint Adomnan was abbot of Iona in the late 7th and early 8th century CE, and the scribe that chronicled most of what we know of Saint Columba. He was originally from Ireland but escaped with St. Columba to help found Iona. It is due to his writings that we know much of the history of this abbey and the workings of St. Columba. St. Columba, Columkill. Born in Ireland to a noble family, he was ejected from the country for ruling against his brother, the king, in a dispute. He moved to Iona in Scotland and founded a monastery there. Although there were Christian missionaries before this time, St. Columba is credited with bringing Christianity to the pagan Picts in the 6th century. Saint David I, King of Scotland. Saint David I was king in the early 12th century CE, becoming king at the death of his brother, Alexander, in 1124. When Stephen I ousted Matilda as heiress to Henry I, her father, Saint David invaded England to help her to her claim. This war became known as the War of the Roses, and lasted for many decades. The war went on without him after several abortive attempts, and he dedicated himself to his land and church. He founded 5 bishoprics and several monasteries, implemented several ideals within the church administration and within the Scottish government. The results of his many changes and reforms became known as the Davidian Revolution. Saint Philin. An Augustinian monk on the Isle of May, he left his native island to convert the Fife populace to Christianity. There is a cave in Cove Wynd, pronounced with a long I, Pittenweem, called Saint Philin's Cave, with some rocks that are thought to be beds and a small holy spring. He is, oddly enough, the patron saint of skydiving. Saint Magnus Erlendsson, Earl of Orkney. Related to several powerful Norwegian kings, he had a reputation for kindness and piety. Around 1105 CE, he refused to participate in a Viking raid to Anglesey, Wales due to his religious convictions. He escaped to Scotland, but then returned to Orkney, which was then part of Norway, and disputed the succession of his cousin, Håkon. They ruled jointly for a time, but then there was a battle at Anglesey Sound. He is reputed to have stayed aboard his ships and sang hymns. Through the treachery of Håkon, Saint Magnus was captured. Håkon made his cook kill St. Magnus with an axe, and the rocky area he was buried in became a green field. Saint Mungo, Kentigern. Saint Mungo was a late 6th century CE apostle of the Brythonic kingdom of Strathclyde who founded the city of Glasgow and became its patron saint. His 4 religious miracles are in the Glasgow City Coat of Arms. His miracles were restoring life to the pet bird of Saint Serf, restarting a fire with branches from a tree, a bell brought from Rome, and the retrieval of a ring from the River Clyde, by having a messenger catch a fish and finding the ring inside. Saints of Lindisfarne. Saint Aidan, an Irishman who was a monk at Iona, he was also known as the Apostle of Northumbria, credited for restoring Christianity in the region. He founded the monastery at Lindisfarne and served as the first bishop. Saint Cuthbert, an Anglo-Saxon monk in the 7th century, he is regarded as the patron saint of Northumbria. Saint Finan, an Irish monk who trained at Iona, he became the bishop of Lindisfarne, founding the cathedral there and converting 2 kings of the Middle Angles, Sigebert of Essex and Piata. Summary. Without a crystal ball, we cannot know, for certain, everything the ancient Scots and Picts held sacred. We can infer, we can guess, we can believe, but we cannot know. They seem to have revered powers that are attached to the land, the weather, the rivers, and the sea, forces that, to them, would have ruled their daily lives. A poor crop, a fierce storm, a bleak winter, any of these could spell out disaster and starvation for a poor crofter, living on the edge of a rocky island. Attempting to control this fate by appealing to a higher power would have been the only option given to them. With the advent of Christianity, this power was consolidated into the Father God, but he had many saints, or appointees, to help those on the ground. I find it interesting that the vast majority of saints in Scotland were from the 6th and 7th centuries, when many of the people of Scotland were likely still pagan at heart and had probably just shifted their beliefs in name to one god, seeing their saints as modern incarnations of the gods and goddesses of old. Many Christian priests appealed to the pagans by comparing their one true God with the pagan gods. One reason for December 25th being chosen as Christmas was to coincide with pagan rituals at Saturnalia and winter solstice. Highland hospitality. Traveller tales. Judith wrote, I lived in Edinburgh for a while, and heard a story about the Edinburgh Acropolis. Edinburgh is known as the Athens of the North, and to honor their sister city, the clans decided to build a replica of the Acropolis on a hill overlooking Edinburgh. The story goes that they ran out of money before it was much beyond the pillar stage, but it was told to me that the real reason that construction was never completed is that they were going to put a plaque at each pillar honoring each of the clans, but they were 2 pillars short and were unable to adequately resolve the difference, so work stopped and was never resumed. The shortfall may have been financial rather than based on clan pride, but the later sounds far more like the folk I met. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. My own story, we had arrived at the second base of our trip, a small B&B in Grantown-on-Spey, near the Cairngorm Mountains. It had been a long drive through the mountains, windy and wet, and we were pretty close to exhausted. We came to our B&B, near the edge of town, Kinross House. It had plenty of parking on the wide street, and as we had 6 people and 2 cars, this was most welcome. Our hostess, Jane, welcomed us with warm tea and biscuits, then showed us to our rooms. After we had settled in, she sat down and chatted with us in the sitting room. She gave us a recommendation for a local pub for some relaxing pints, and off we went, down the street to Craig's Bar. The folks at Craig's were definitely characters. The mother, aged 65 to 70, was planning on going off to China that summer to watch the Olympics. Most of her budget was for the flight, as she planned on flying business class. She wanted to have comfort on the long flight but planned on staying in hostels and camping once she was in China, to save money. She shared some stories of her own, as well. We told her our next stop would be Orkney, and she mentioned she used to live and work there. She showed us the lovely jewelry they gave her as a going-away present, one of Sheila Fleet's lovely designs, a round pendant with Ogham symbols and blue-green enamel work. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Kimberly wrote, we had great experiences in Edinburgh. On arrival to Scotland, we booked a single night in a restored Georgian terrace house called Garlands. We didn't realize until we got there that it was a gay-friendly guest house. One of the owners, Bill, greeted us at the door in very tight shorts and a skin-hugging tank top. Bill was super. We asked about a local place for dinner, so he picked up the phone and was dialing the phone while pushing us out the door. Don't you worry, he said. Your table will be waiting when you get there. He gave us directions to an Italian place at the end of the road called Sorrento, and off we went. We walked in and 2 men rushed us. I wish I could remember their names, but the Irish owner was tending bar while the Scottish owner served tables, midweek, so it wasn't too busy, but enough people to get the full effect of what came next. They both rushed us, arms open wide, calling out as they came forward, "Peter! Kimberly! My God, welcome!" Hugs and cheek kisses for us both and more fawning as they showed us to our table, the whole while treating us like we were celebrities who had honored them with our presence. Everyone in the place started whispering and pointing at us. And it was like that for most of the evening. It turns out Sorrento was owned by two best friends, one a Scotsman from Leith, just outside Edinburgh, and the other a man from Wexford, Ireland. The next morning at breakfast, we were the center attraction as the only male and female couple in the place, and the other owner, Ian, fawned over us too. So, I asked in conversation how they came up with the name of the house, since neither were called Garland. Bill laughed and said, "Darling, it's for Judy. Judy Garland, one of the most revered gay icons." On the return visit to Edinburgh on the end of our trip, we had a couple nights in another guest house on the same road as Garland's, as it was booked out, called Abbotsford Guest House, owned by a really lovely Scottish-Italian woman called Paula. Very accommodating and helpful with things to do and see around the city. She was full of stories and chat, and she clued us into the free shuttle into town across the road. It's not an official one, but since the coach company was located on the end of the road, they'll often stop and pick up passengers going into the city if you know where to stand. And since they're going that way anyway. We had 2 nights at Abbotsford, and that meant 2 more nights at Sorrento. We walked in and both the owners stopped in their tracks and stared at us. Then we got a very shocked, "Oh my God! We thought we scared you away." They didn't know we were traveling after that first night and thought we'd been scared away. They fawned all over us again, but not as dramatically as the very first night. It was more like apologetic fawning, but in a typically humorous, Celtic sort of way. Indignant but not really, the kind with a, "You must have felt very put out to have gone through that. Oh my God!" Then big winks and a sly grin that warned us something else was coming. It was drinks, on the house. On the final night, we went back to Sorrento and things were much calmer. Every other night it had been busy enough that they attended to their diners yet always had a spare moment to drop over to see how things were going, and usually spend an inordinate amount of time telling us one thing or another. But this night they practically sat down to dinner with us. It was great. Such lovely people to chat with. Of course, your man from Wexford was looking for news from home, too, and we were happy to oblige. A funny add-on was each night for dessert, I had their bread and butter pudding, and each time I'd picked out the sultanas, raisins. That night, the Scottish owner didn't even ask for our dessert order since we ordered the same thing the previous 2 visits. He went to the kitchen and brought back a bread pudding, in a special bowl made separately just for me. No raisins. When we finally were ready to leave, we told them it was our last night in the city and going back to Ireland the next day. I swear, it was like the parting of 4 of the best pals on the planet. I thought we were all going to cry. When I got home and started working with Scottish travel clients, I made sure they always had at least 1 meal in Sorrento and told them to tell the guys we had sent them. When the travelers got home, they emailed right away to tell us about the 2 insane guys in the Italian place. Asterisk. Christy wrote, "The lodge at Edinburgh has got to be my favorite B&B on our entire trip in 2008. It was wonderful. Large, rambling property, lots of rooms, a pub and dining room on property, everything run by Hazel, Pete, and Cal. It even had resident ghosties to keep you company at night. And yes, even though all the rooms on the website were pink, she had some purple, and even some blue rooms, available. The pub had some wonderful meals. We had dinner there a couple nights, and breakfast was part of our B&B rate. They offered everything from cheese salads to beef bourguignon. One night, I had a lovely smoked mackerel salad, and it was quite strong. The cheese salad does sound strange, but looks tasty, a nice salad of greens and veg with several different cheeses on it, including brie, cranberry Stilton, feta, etc. One evening, 4 of us continued to have drinks at the pub until almost midnight, outwaiting several locals who were shepherds drinking in the bar. One decided that he should start serenading us. It would have been lovely if we could have figured out what he was singing. Hazel always wowed us with her breakfasts. She made Scottish pancakes for all, which are sweeter than the American version. She also served crystallized ginger preserve with them that was simply delectable and very addictive. My friend, Kim, practically growled when we tried to take some of hers. We had a couple ghost encounters. Kim saw a shadowed figure in her room one night, though she felt no fear of it. It went away rather quickly. Jason heard rapping on the closet door, which was right next to where I was sleeping. He looked for any reason for it, air vents, mechanisms, etc., and couldn't find a rational explanation for the tapping. We were told that the ghost in that room was a rather prim Victorian lady, and if we told her we were married, she would stop complaining. Jason also heard a ghost dog walking across the hardwood floor in front of him. Now, he had been sipping whiskey in front of the peat fire, relaxing that afternoon, and while the place had 3 dogs, they were all big dogs, Labradors, and all outside. This sounded like a small dog, clicking along right in front of him. Hazel and her family made us feel so much at home that we will definitely be back the next trip. And Skye is such a fantastic area that we can't help but go there again.